I had been planning the trip for a while. Hiking had always been something that gave me a strange mix of calm and unease. I liked being alone in the woods, where there were no phones buzzing, no cars speeding by, no buildings pressing in. But at the same time, I knew there was danger in that kind of isolation. Out there, you were on your own. If something went wrong, help wasn't just a phone call away. That's part of what made me feel drawn to it. It was like testing myself against the quiet, against the miles, against the unknown things that might happen when nobody else was around. I picked a trail that I hadn't done before. It was out in the mountains, several hours from where I lived. The trail was long, about 15 miles round trip, winding up through thick forest, climbing along ridgelines, and finally reaching a high clearing that gave a wide view of the valleys below. The reports I had read online made it sound like a challenge, not too hard but long enough to wear you out. That was exactly what I wanted. I left early in the morning. The sky was gray, with the kind of heavy clouds that made you think rain was possible but not certain. The air was cool. I had packed my backpack the night before, making sure I had food, water, a map, a headlamp, a jacket, a small first aid kit, and a knife. I didn't expect to need most of it, but leaving without it felt foolish. I parked at the small dirt lot near the trailhead and noticed only one other car there. That meant at least one other person was out there, though the trail was long and there was no guarantee I would see them. The first mile of the hike was steady uphill through trees that blocked most of the view. The ground was damp, and my boots sank slightly into the mud where water had run down across the trail. I walked slowly, pacing myself, keeping an ear out for the usual noises of the forest. Birds, the creak of branches, the occasional rustle of something small in the underbrush. Everything seemed normal at first, and I felt myself relaxing into the rhythm of walking. After about 2 miles, the trees thinned and the trail crossed a small wooden bridge over a stream. The water moved quickly, carrying sticks and foam along with it. I stopped to refill one of my water bottles using a filter I had brought. While crouching down, I noticed how quiet it was. The kind of quiet where you expect to hear something, but there's nothing. No birds, no wind moving the branches, no insects buzzing, just the water rushing. I didn't think much of it at first, but the silence stayed in my mind as I started walking again. The trail climbed higher, weaving in and out of the forest. Sometimes it opened up to give a view of steep hillsides covered in endless trees. Other times it closed in tightly, with dark pines on both sides pressing against the path. I kept moving at a steady pace, but the quiet stayed. Usually the forest was alive with noise, even if it was far away. But that morning, it was like the woods were holding their breath. By the 4th mile, I felt the weight of the backpack digging into my shoulders. I adjusted the straps and kept going. The ground here was rougher, rocks scattered across the trail, roots twisting underfoot. I had to watch every step. As I walked, I noticed something odd. The mud on the trail had footprints in it. Not unusual since other hikers came through here, but these were fresh. The edges were sharp, not yet softened by wind or time. I could tell the person was wearing boots, but they were large, wider than mine, longer too. Whoever made them had passed not too long before me. I followed them without thinking. Step after step, the footprints matched the trail ahead. After a while, I realized there weren't just one set of tracks. There were 2. One was larger, heavier, the other slightly smaller. They moved together for a while, then split apart briefly where the mud spread wide across the trail, before joining again. I told myself it was nothing, just 2 hikers, maybe the people who owned the car I had seen. Still, there was something about it that made me uneasy. I didn't hear them ahead of me, not even the crunch of boots or the sound of talking. If they were moving at the same pace as me, I should have heard something. But the forest stayed silent. By mile 6, the clouds above had thickened. The light had a dull, gray cast. I stopped to eat a snack and drink water. As I rested, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was the kind of feeling you get when someone is watching you, even when you know nobody's around. I looked behind me, scanning the trees, but saw nothing, just the empty trail winding back down the mountain. I kept walking, pushing the feeling away. The trail climbed steeply now, switchbacks carrying me higher toward the ridgeline. My legs burned, and sweat dampened the back of my shirt, but I welcomed the effort, kept my mind focused. I followed the footprints still, though the mud was less common here. When I did see them, they were sharp and recent. Whoever was ahead of me hadn't passed long before. At mile 8, I reached the ridgeline. The forest fell away on both sides, and the trail followed the spine of the mountain. The wind picked up, carrying a sharp chill. I could see miles in both directions, valleys stretching away, clouds pressing low against distant peaks. I paused to take it in, then noticed something down the ridge. Far ahead, where the trail curved, a figure moved. It was small at first, just a dark shape against the gray, but I could tell it was a person. The figure moved slowly, pausing now and then as if checking something on the ground. My first thought was that it was one of the hikers who had made the tracks. But as I watched, I realized I only saw one person. The second was missing. I hesitated, then kept going. The trail was long, and I didn't want to stop halfway. The figure stayed ahead of me for a while, always just far enough that I couldn't make out details. When the trail dipped into the trees again, I lost sight of them. Inside the forest, the light grew dimmer. The air smelled damp, earthy, heavy with the scent of moss. The ground was soft with fallen needles, muffling my steps. I felt the quiet again, stronger this time. No birds, no animals, just the sound of my breathing. I looked down and saw the footprints again, fresh, deeper now, as if the person had been moving faster. I followed them for another mile before I noticed something that froze me in place. On the side of the trail, the dirt was scuffed, as if someone had slipped or been pushed. Branches were broken, snapped at chest height. And there was something else, a mark in the dirt that wasn't a footprint. It was more like a drag, a long groove leading off the trail into the trees. I stared at it, my mind racing. Could have been nothing, maybe an animal, maybe a hiker who stumbled and caught themselves. But the drag mark was long, uneven, like something heavy had been pulled. I stood there longer than I should have, listening, waiting for some sound to explain it. Nothing came. I forced myself to keep moving. The trail narrowed here, weaving between thick pines. My stomach felt tight, and every step felt heavier. The footprints stayed ahead, sharp and clear. Only one set now, the larger ones. Mile 11. The forest opened again into a small clearing. In the center was an old fire ring, stones blackened from use long ago. I stopped, looking around. Something about the place felt wrong. The ground was torn up, patches of dirt and grass ripped away. On the far side of the clearing, I saw it, something dark against the earth. I walked closer before I realized what it was. A backpack. It was lying on its side, one strap twisted, half buried in the dirt. I crouched down, heart hammering. It looked new, not weathered, not abandoned for long. A water bottle still strapped to the side, a jacket tied to the back. I didn't touch it. I just stared, my mouth dry. The trail continued past the clearing, footprints leading away from the backpack. Only one set. I stood there, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to turn back right then. Whatever was happening ahead wasn't normal. But another part of me couldn't. If someone was in trouble, if something bad had happened, leaving without knowing felt worse. I followed the tracks again, each step heavy, my chest tight. The forest grew darker, the clouds overhead blocking what little sunlight was left. My headlamp was in my pack, but I didn't take it out yet. I didn't want to stop moving. By mile 13, I was deep in the woods again. The footprints led on, clear, sharp, heavy. My legs ached, my throat was dry, and my nerves were stretched thin. Then I heard it, a sound, not far ahead. A low, steady noise, like breathing. I froze, straining to hear. Came again, louder this time. Not breathing, something dragging, something heavy pulled across the ground. I stood there, my whole body tight, my mind screaming to leave. I took one slow step back, then another. My boots sank into the dirt, crunching louder than I wanted. The sound ahead stopped. The forest was silent again. I didn't wait any longer. I turned and started back down the trail, moving fast, Not running, but close to it. My heart pounded in my ear. I had been planning the hike for months. It wasn't supposed to be anything extraordinary, just a long trail in the mountains that I had read about in a guidebook. The trail wasn't the most famous or popular one in the area, but it stretched for over 20 miles through thick forest, steep ridges, and narrow valleys. What drew me to it was the promise of isolation. I had been stressed with work, with life in general, and I thought a few days out there alone would be what I needed to reset myself. I imagined silence, only broken by the sound of my boots on dirt, the wind through the trees, and maybe the rush of water when I passed streams. I had hiked alone before, but never something this long and remote. I checked the maps many times. The trail looped out far into the wilderness and curved back around. The guidebook had warned that cell service dropped almost immediately after the first few miles. I wasn't nervous about that. I had carried a compass, a map, and a small GPS device with me. I had extra food, a tent, a sleeping bag, and everything I thought I needed. I figured I had prepared well enough. I parked my car at the trailhead early one morning. The lot was empty, which I liked. It gave me the feeling that this stretch of land was mine to explore, at least for the next few days. The air was cool and damp, with that thick smell of pine and earth. My backpack felt heavier than I had hoped, but I told myself it would feel lighter once I got used to it. The first few miles were beautiful. The trail cut through a wide section of forest, where the sunlight broke in pieces through the tall trees. Birds darted overhead. The ground was damp from rain the night before. I kept a steady pace, taking deep breaths of the clean air. I felt good, strong, ready for whatever the hike brought me. By noon, the trail began to climb. I stopped often to drink water, leaning against trees and catching my breath. My legs burned, but I didn't mind it. I wanted that exhaustion, the kind that comes from hard work in nature. I ate a snack, tightened the straps of my pack, and kept going. As the hours passed, the trail narrowed. The trees grew closer together, taller, darker. I realized then how quickly isolation can sink in. One moment I was comforted by the stillness, and the next I was uneasy. I hadn't seen another person since I left my car. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It pressed against me. I began to notice every little sound. The crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves. Sometimes it was probably just squirrels or birds, but out there, alone, every noise felt different. I pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the trail. I reached a ridge by late afternoon. The ground dropped sharply on either side, and the path was only a few feet wide. I had to watch every step carefully. The wind was stronger up there, carrying a sharp chill even though the sun was still up. I tried not to look down too much, just kept my eyes on where my boots were landing. By the time the sun dipped low, I had made it past the ridge and down into a valley. The trail ran alongside a narrow creek there, and the ground was softer. I found a flat spot just off the path to set up my tent. I boiled water, ate a quick meal, and sat for a while listening to the creek. Darkness spread slowly until the forest was black around me. The sound of the water was constant, steady, but it didn't drown out the other noises. Twigs snapped in the distance now and then. Leaves shifted with movements I couldn't see. I reminded myself that animals lived here, and I was just a visitor. I zipped myself into my tent, pulled the sleeping bag tight, and tried to sleep. The first night wasn't restful. Every little sound outside seemed to drag me back to full alertness. I thought about bears, about mountain lions, about strangers I couldn't see. My knife was close to me, but it didn't give me much comfort. I drifted in and out of shallow sleep until the faint gray light of morning finally seeped into the tent. I packed up quickly and got back on the trail. The morning was cold, and my breath puffed out in front of me. My legs felt heavy, but I forced myself forward. The valley seemed endless, and the trees blocked most of the light. Hours passed before I finally came to an open stretch where the trail climbed again. I pushed myself hard to make it to the top, where I hoped for a view that would remind me why I was out there. When I reached the ridge, the sight stopped me. Rolling mountains stretched for miles, all covered in dark forest. No towns, no houses, No roads, just wilderness. It was beautiful, but instead of feeling awe, I felt small. The thought struck me hard that if something happened to me out there, no one would know. I was just a speck swallowed by miles of land. I didn't linger long at the top. I followed the path down the other side, my mind heavier than my pack. The trail twisted through thick brush, sometimes so narrow I had to push branches out of my way. The sun was hidden again, and I couldn't tell how far I had gone. It was mid-afternoon when I noticed it. At first, I thought I was just imagining things, but soon I was certain. There were boot prints on the trail, fresh ones. The dirt was soft from rain, and I could see the shape clearly. They weren't mine, I had different tread. The steps were pointed in the same direction I was walking. The realization sent a jolt through me. I hadn't seen anyone all day. The parking lot was empty when I arrived. Someone else had to be out here. That wasn't unusual, of course. People hike trails all the time. But the thought that someone was ahead of me, unseen, made me uneasy. I slowed my pace, listening harder than before. The forest seemed too quiet. As the hours dragged on, I kept seeing the prints. Sometimes they veered slightly off the trail, like whoever made them had stepped aside. Other times they looked rushed, pressed deep into the soil. My mouth was dry even though I kept drinking water. I made camp earlier that evening, not far from the trail. I couldn't shake the thought of those prints. I kept imagining another person in the woods, not far away, maybe even watching me. My mind spun with possibilities, another hiker, a hunter, someone living illegally out there. I ate quickly, not tasting the food, and crawled into my tent before the light was gone. That night was worse. I barely slept. Every crunch outside made me freeze. At one point, I was sure I heard footsteps near my tent. Slow, deliberate ones. I held my breath and gripped the knife in my hand, waiting, my heart pounding so loud it filled my ears. Minutes passed, but nothing happened. I didn't dare move. When the morning came, I unzipped my tent with stiff hands. The ground outside looked normal, but I didn't linger to check closely. I shoved my gear into my pack and got moving fast. I wanted out of that valley. The trail grew rougher. Rocks jutted up, roots snaked across the ground. My legs shook from exhaustion, but I didn't stop. Around midday, I paused only long enough to eat a protein bar, then kept going. I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. I didn't hear anyone, but I didn't need to. The thought itself was enough to keep me tense. Late in the day, the trail descended again toward another creek. I bent down to fill my water bottle, and that's when I saw it. A footprint, fresh, right on the edge of the water. Bigger than mine. Whoever it was, they had been there not long before me. My stomach knotted. I stood frozen, listening, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. The forest was thick and shadowy. I hurried away from the creek, barely giving myself time to catch my breath. By the time darkness fell, I was too exhausted to keep going. I found a spot under a cluster of pines, set up my tent as quickly as I could, and climbed inside. I didn't cook, didn't eat, just laid in my sleeping bag staring at the ceiling. Every sound outside felt sharper, closer. At one point, I swore I heard breathing. Not mine, not animal. Heavy, steady breathing outside my tent. I stayed perfectly still for what felt like hours. The sound faded eventually, but I couldn't sleep after that. My body ached with tension. The next morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to finish the loop. I needed to get back. According to my map, there was a connector trail a few miles ahead that could cut me back toward the trailhead. It would shorten my trip by a day. I folded the map carefully, shoved it in my pocket, and set out. The connector trail was narrower, rougher, and clearly less used. Branches clawed at me as I passed. The sense of isolation deepened. My GPS told me I was on track, but it didn't comfort me much. The forest swallowed everything. Hours passed in silence, except for the crunch of my boots. Then, late in the afternoon, I came across something that froze me in place. A campsite, not an official one, just a clearing where someone had set up. There was a ring of rocks blackened from fire, pile of trash, and a tarp strung between trees sagging old. No one was there now, but it looked used recently. I stared at it, my chest tight. Whoever had made those footprints might have stayed here. Maybe they still were close by. I backed away. I had been planning the hike for weeks, looking at maps and reading small notes from people online who had written about the area. It wasn't a well-known trail, not the type with big signs or a visitor center. It was one of those paths that had been carved out years ago, used mostly by hunters and maybe old rangers, then forgotten. I wanted something like that. I was tired of crowded trails where every few minutes you ran into someone carrying trekking poles and a day pack. I wanted silence. I wanted to feel cut off, even if only for a day or two. I set out on a cool September morning, the kind where the air feels sharp in your lungs and the ground is still damp from the night before. The first part of the trail was nothing special, just a dirt road that narrowed into a thin path. The trees were tall pines with thick branches that blocked a lot of the sun, so it felt dim even though the day had started clear. My pack was heavy, but I had brought everything I thought I'd need. A tent, sleeping bag, extra food, a water filter, even a small emergency kit. The first few miles were easy. The path was narrow but still visible. The forest was quiet, and all I could hear was the crunch of my boots on pine needles and the sound of my breathing. Every now and then a bird would fly up from the brush, or a squirrel would dart across the path, but mostly it was still. I kept moving deeper. By midday, I had gone farther than I had planned. I wanted to stop and eat, but the trail didn't really open up anywhere. The trees pressed close on both sides, and the undergrowth was thick. I pushed on, thinking maybe I'd find a clearing soon. When I finally did stop, it was on a patch of flattened grass where the sun managed to cut through. I sat on my pack and ate a sandwich, drank some water, and looked around. That's when I noticed it. The trail ahead seemed different. Up until then, it had been fairly straight, just weaving a little around trees. But ahead, it dipped down sharply into a narrow ravine. The sides were steep, and the trail almost disappeared into shadows. I checked my map. The paper wasn't very detailed, it only showed rough outlines, but there was nothing about a ravine. Still, the trail went that way, so I followed it. Going down wasn't hard, but it felt strange. The air got cooler quickly, and the smell of damp soil was stronger. At the bottom, the ground was muddy. I saw prints in it. Deer, raccoon, maybe even a bear. They overlapped and sank deep, showing this place stayed wet most of the time. The trail curved along the bottom of the ravine, the sides rising above me like walls. I walked slowly, keeping my balance on slick rocks. That was when I realized how quiet it had become. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just the sound of water dripping somewhere. The walls of the ravine pressed in, and I had the strange thought that if someone were up top watching me, I wouldn't even know. I kept going until finally the path climbed back up the other side. At the top, I stopped to catch my breath and looked back. From there, the ravine looked like a deep scar in the earth, hidden under the trees. I had a sudden urge to turn back, but I pushed it away. I wanted to see where this forgotten trail went. The forest on this side was different. The trees were spaced farther apart, and the ground was covered in dry leaves instead of pine needles. It was brighter too, with more sunlight reaching through. I checked my watch. It was later than I thought. I needed to start thinking about where I'd camp for the night. I walked for another hour before I found a spot. It was a flat rise with a few fallen logs I could use for sitting. I cleared a space, set up my tent, and cooked a small meal on my stove. As the sun went down, the forest grew colder. I heard a few sounds, an owl, the rustle of small animals, but it still felt quieter than any forest I'd camped in before. That night, I lay in my tent listening. I wasn't scared, not exactly, but I was alert. Every sound seemed sharp. At one point, I thought I heard something moving slowly through the leaves not far away, but when I unzipped the tent and looked out with my headlamp, the light showed only trees and shadows. I told myself it was probably a deer. The next morning, I packed up and kept moving. The trail narrowed even more, twisting through trees and crossing streams. Several times I lost sight of it completely and had to look for signs of where it picked up again. I noticed the ground was less traveled. No boot prints, no signs of recent use. By afternoon, I felt uneasy. The path climbed again, this time onto a ridge. The trees thinned, and I could see farther. In the distance, there were no signs of roads or towns, just endless green hills and valleys. I pulled out my map and compass, checked my bearings, and realized I was farther out than I had planned to go. Turning back would take at least a full day, maybe longer. That was when I noticed something strange. Off to the right, down the slope, there was what looked like a structure. Not a house exactly, but maybe a cabin or shed. The roof was old and covered in moss. From where I stood, it looked abandoned. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I left the trail and pushed through the brush to get a closer look. When I reached it, I saw it was indeed a cabin. The wood was gray and splintered, the windows broken. The door was half open, hanging crooked on its hinges. It looked like no one had lived there for decades. I peered inside. The floor was covered in leaves and dirt. There was a broken chair, a rusted stove, and a few old cans scattered on the ground. The place smelled damp and moldy. I didn't go inside. Something about it felt wrong. I turned back and climbed up to the trail. But now the woods felt different, heavier somehow. I walked faster, wanting to put distance between myself and that cabin. The sun was already dropping when I found a place to camp. This time I chose a spot farther from the trail, under a cluster of trees where the ground was soft. I set up quickly, cooked, and tried to relax. But all evening, I couldn't shake the image of that cabin. That night was worse than the first. I kept waking up. At one point, I heard what sounded like footsteps outside my tent. Slow, steady, crunching on leaves. My heart pounded. I grabbed my flashlight, but when I shined it through the tent walls, I saw nothing. I stayed still, hardly breathing. The sound went on for a few more steps, then stopped. I waited a long time before I dared move. The next morning, I checked around the tent. No tracks, just leaves and dirt. I told myself maybe it was an animal again, but deep down I wasn't sure. I decided I needed to head back. I packed quickly and started retracing my steps. But after an hour, I realized something terrifying. The trail didn't look the same. I thought I was following it, but then it split or faded, and I couldn't find the same markings I remembered. I tried to use my compass and map, but the map was too vague for this part of the forest. Panic started to creep in. I forced myself to stay calm and picked what looked like the most worn path. But it led me deeper into thick brush. I pushed through, scratched by branches, sweating even though the air was cool. By afternoon, I knew I was lost. I'll keep going into the full 7,000 plus word expansion, with every moment drawn out in detail, until the ending where I make it out. Realistic, no fantasy, no ghosts. I had always liked hiking alone. There was something about being out in the woods with nothing but my own steps, the air moving through the trees, and the long stretch of trail ahead of me that made me feel calm. I planned my hikes carefully. I studied maps, checked the weather, and packed what I thought I needed. I wasn't careless. I wasn't out there looking for trouble. But no matter how much you plan, sometimes things just go in a way you never expect. It started on a summer morning. The air was warm but not yet heavy with the kind of heat that makes every step feel harder than it should. I had chosen a trail in the mountains about 2 hours from home. It was supposed to be challenging but not extreme, around 14 miles round trip, leading to a high ridge where you could see out for miles. I liked trails like that, enough distance to push myself, enough elevation to feel it in my legs, but not something that seemed impossible. I parked my car in the gravel lot at the base of the trail just after sunrise. The lot was nearly empty, which I liked. A couple of trucks, one small car, but not many. That meant quiet. I checked my pack again before I left. Water bottles, trail mix, protein bars, a first aid kit, flashlight, headlamp, knife, extra shirt, and a light rain jacket. I carried a map and compass even though I had a GPS app on my phone. I like to have both. My boots were tied snug. I locked the car, slung the pack on, and started walking. The first section of the trail was wide, packed dirt with roots and stones jutting out here and there. The trees were tall and close, the the kind of forest where the light came down in narrow beams that made the air look dusty even though it wasn't. I walked steady, breathing even, letting the sound of the gravel and dirt under my boots set the pace. I felt good, strong, the kind of good you feel when you know the day is yours and you don't have to rush. After about 2 miles, the trail narrowed. It started to climb, winding up through switchbacks that cut across the mountain slope. The higher I went, the quieter it became. I stopped hearing cars on the distant road. I stopped hearing anything but my own steps and the occasional snap of a twig from some unseen animal. Squirrels maybe, or deer. I told myself that, even though sometimes it didn't sound like a small animal. Sometimes the noise was heavier, like something big shifting its weight. I brushed that off. The woods always sound different when you're alone. Every sound seems closer, sharper. I kept walking. Hours passed like that. Uphill, downhill, across narrow ridges where the drop off the side was steep enough to make me keep my eyes on my feet instead of the view. I drank water when I needed to. I chewed on a protein bar when my stomach started to growl. The sun climbed higher, heating the air, but the forest shade kept it bearable. Around midday, I reached a clearing where the trees opened up. From there, I could see across a valley. The hills rolled out, covered in dark green, and in the distance, the ridge I was heading toward stood higher than the rest. It looked farther than I expected. My legs were already tired, but I told myself I could make it. I had plenty of time. I always told myself that. I pressed on. The trail became rougher as I got closer to the ridge. Rocks scattered across it, roots twisting like ropes under the dirt. I stumbled once or twice but caught myself. I noticed how quiet it had become. Even the birds weren't making noise, just the wind brushing through the leaves. I adjusted my pack and kept going. It was late afternoon by the time I reached the ridge. The view was wide, stretching out in every direction. Hills, valleys, rivers cutting through the land like silver lines. It was worth the climb, worth the sweat and the ache in my calves. I stood there for a while, catching my breath, drinking the last of one water bottle and eating another bar. I knew I needed to head back soon. The sun would start dropping, and I didn't want to be caught out there in the dark. But when I turned to start down, I noticed something. The trail didn't look the same. I had come up one way, but when I turned back, the direction I thought I had come from didn't line up with what I remembered. I looked around carefully. The ridge had several small paths leading away, some clear, some faint. I tried to think back, to picture the way I had come up, but it was like my memory slipped. Everything looked too similar. I picked what I thought was the right path and started down. At first it seemed fine. The trail wound down the slope like it should. But after a while, I realized I hadn't seen certain markers I remembered on the way up. A large boulder shaped like a leaning face. A split tree with a hollow base. Those had stuck out to me earlier, but now they weren't there. I stopped, pulled out my map, and tried to match the lines and curves with where I thought I was. The problem was, the map didn't show every little path. It showed the main trail, but not these side ones. My phone's GPS had no service, just a blank screen with a spinning circle. I felt a slow unease creep in. I wasn't panicking yet, but I knew this wasn't good. I should have been more careful at the ridge. I should have marked my spot. I told myself to stay calm. I kept walking. The trail dipped into a darker section of woods. The trees pressed close, their branches clawing over the top, blocking much of the light. The ground was damp, soft, with patches of mud that sucked at my boots. I checked my watch. The sun was sinking lower. The air felt cooler. I kept thinking if I just followed the trail long enough, it would connect back to the main one. But it didn't. Instead, it twisted deeper. The ground grew uneven. At one point, the trail split again. Two thin paths leading in different directions. Neither looked right. I stood there for a long minute, heart beating harder than before, listening to the silence pressing in. I picked the left one. The forest grew heavier, darker. My legs ached more with each step. I stopped for water, realizing I had only one full bottle left. My throat was dry, and I forced myself to take small sips instead of gulps. Then I heard it, a sound behind me. It wasn't the snap of a twig or the rustle of a squirrel. It was heavier, a branch breaking under weight. My whole body froze. I turned slowly, eyes scanning the shadows. First, nothing. Just trees, brush, silence. Then another sound. Closer this time. I gripped the straps of my pack and started walking faster. My boots hit the ground harder, louder. I hated how much noise I made, but I couldn't help it. My chest tightened. The sound came again, as if something was pacing me, staying just far enough behind to be unseen. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, maybe a bear, but the way it matched my pace didn't feel right. I walked faster. The trail narrowed, dipping into a small ravine. Rocks jutted out, and I had to use my hands to steady myself. My breath came shorter, sharper. When I glanced back, I thought I saw movement, a shadow between trees, something upright. I blinked hard, telling myself my mind was playing tricks. But then I heard it again, the crunch of weight on leaves. I didn't run yet, but I was close. My pulse hammered in my ears. The sun was lower now, the light fading. I pulled my flashlight from my pack and kept it in my hand, just in case. The trail wound deeper into the woods. I didn't know where I was anymore. The map was useless. My phone was useless. All I had was the fading light and the sound of something behind me. I kept moving. I always thought of myself as careful when it came to the outdoors. I wasn't an expert hiker, but I had been on enough trails to know how easy it was to get into trouble if you didn't respect the land. I read maps, packed extra food, and carried water and a small first aid kit. I told myself I wasn't the type of person who would ever become one of those stories you hear about where someone disappears in the woods. But the truth is, you don't really know how quickly things can spiral out of control until you experience it for yourself. It started on a warm summer morning. I had planned a day hike alone in a mountain range a few hours from home. The area was popular but large, with dozens of different trails. My plan was to start early, follow a marked loop, and return before dark. I wanted to test myself on a trail that was a little longer than what I usually did. It wasn't extreme, just more remote than I was used to. I packed my small backpack with water, snacks, a sandwich, some trail mix, a rain jacket, a headlamp, and my phone. I had downloaded a map offline and felt confident. The first few hours went exactly as expected. The trail was narrow but easy to follow. The ground was a mix of packed dirt, pine needles, and loose stones. The air smelled of sap and damp moss, and the sun filtered through tall trees. My footsteps and the occasional bird were the only sounds I heard. I felt calm and steady. Hiking alone gave me a kind of quiet that I never felt in my normal life. By midday, I reached a fork where two trails split. One pointed back toward the parking area if you followed it far enough, and the other curved deeper into the forest. According to the map, both would eventually lead me back, but one was longer and passed by an overlook that I thought would be worth seeing. I had plenty of time, so I chose the longer way. That decision set everything else in motion. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The trees grew taller and closer together. The ground was damp, and I noticed the air felt cooler. I didn't see any other hikers. I told myself it was fine, that I had the map, and I would be back on the main loop eventually. I walked steadily for another hour before I started to feel uneasy. The trail markers grew harder to see. At first, there were painted blazes on trees every few minutes, but soon they were spread far apart. The path itself became narrow and overgrown in places. I kept going, confident that the overlook was coming up soon. I hadn't realized yet that I had missed a turn. When I finally noticed that the trail seemed wrong, I stopped. The dirt path I had been following had faded until it looked more like flattened grass and scattered rocks than a trail. I pulled out my phone and opened the map. The GPS dot showed me off the line of the trail, but the thick tree cover made the location jump around. Sometimes it looked like I was on the trail, sometimes not. I told myself I had just strayed a little and needed to backtrack. I turned around and tried to follow my steps back. That's when I realized how hard it was to retrace a path in the forest. Everything looked the same. Pine trees, brush, and uneven ground stretched in every direction. The way I thought I had come from didn't line up with the faint prints in the dirt. I felt the first tight knot of fear in my stomach. I walked back carefully, looking for the last blaze on a tree. Minutes passed, then half an hour. I didn't see it. The path seemed to split into several faint animal tracks. I picked one, then another, doubling back when it didn't look right. I tried to stay calm, but my legs moved faster. The forest felt thicker. After another 30 minutes, I accepted that I was lost. I stopped moving and stood still, breathing heavily, sweat dripping down my back even though the air was cool. I pulled out my phone again. The battery was already lower than I liked, and the signal was gone. The map loaded but showed only the dot moving slowly as I shifted in place. No real detail, no clear trail. I told myself not to panic. I still had water and food. It was only the afternoon. I could get my bearings. I sat down on a rock and tried to think. I remembered that the sun was still high and the parking lot was west of me, so I decided I would keep the sun to my left as I moved, hoping it would lead me back. It sounded like a plan, but it was just guessing. I started walking again, pushing through brush that scratched my legs. The ground sloped downward, then upward again. My breathing grew harder as I climbed. The sun dipped behind clouds for a while, and I lost my sense of direction. Every step felt heavier. Branches cracked under my boots, and insects buzzed in my ears. An hour later, I hadn't found anything that looked familiar. My water bottle was half empty. I stopped again and ate some trail mix, trying to calm my shaking hands. My mind kept going to worst-case scenarios. Spending the night out there, not being able to find the way back, my phone dying. I imagined rescuers searching days later. The forest grew darker as the afternoon stretched on. I noticed more animal signs now. Broken branches, claw marks on a tree, scat in the dirt. My stomach twisted. I wasn't in a place hikers usually went. This was deeper wilderness, where animals roamed undisturbed. Every sound made me turn my head quickly. By evening, I knew I wouldn't make it out before dark. I looked for a place to stop. The ground was uneven everywhere, but I found a small flat area near a cluster of rocks. I forced myself to sit, eat my sandwich, and save some water. I tried to prepare myself mentally for the night. When darkness fell, the forest changed completely. The air grew colder, and every small noise seemed amplified. I heard rustling in the brush, snapping twigs, distant calls of animals I couldn't recognize. I kept my headlamp off most of the time to save the battery, sitting still in the dark. My body shook from a mix of cold and fear. I didn't sleep at all. The night was endless. I counted the minutes in my head, waiting for the faint light of morning. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard footsteps moving near me. I would open them again, heart pounding, shining the light, only to see trees and shadows. Finally, dawn came. I stood stiffly, legs aching, throat dry. I had only a little water left. I forced myself to move again. I decided to follow a low point in the terrain, hoping it might lead to a stream or trail. I remembered that water often led to signs of people. Hours passed as I followed the slope down. The ground grew muddy, and eventually, I heard trickling water. Relief washed over me when I saw a narrow creek cutting through the rocks. I drank a little, even though I knew it wasn't safe untreated. I filled my bottle anyway, desperate. I followed the creek for hours. My legs felt heavier with each step, and my mind grew foggy. I stumbled more than once on slick stones. But finally, in the distance, I noticed something unnatural. A cut log, squared off by a saw. I rushed toward it. Soon I saw more signs of human work and then a faint dirt road. When I stepped onto the road, I felt tears in my eyes. I wasn't safe yet, but I was out of the endless maze of trees. I walked along the road for another hour before I heard the sound of a truck engine in the distance. I waved my arms when it came into view, stumbling toward it. The driver slowed and stared at me with wide eyes before letting me climb into the back. He drove me down the road until we reached a ranger station. My legs almost gave out when I stepped out. I was dirty, scraped, and exhausted. They gave me water, asked questions, and told me I had ended up miles off the marked trail. I sat there, shivering, while the weight of the whole experience sank in. I realized how close I had been to becoming one of those stories you read about. All it had taken was one wrong turn, one decision to take a longer path. The forest hadn't cared about my confidence or my plans. That night, back at home, I lay in bed unable to sleep, hearing every rustle and crack from memory. I thought about the long hours of being lost, the feeling of the dark pressing in, the sounds I couldn't explain, the fear that no one knew where I was. I promised myself I would never hike alone again without better preparation. It's easy to think you're careful enough until you learn the truth. Out there, one mistake can mean everything. I made it back, but I know how close I came to disappearing into that forest for good. I always liked being outdoors, but I wasn't the type who joined big groups or went on guided tours. I preferred to go alone, setting my own pace, deciding where to stop, and taking in the quiet without hearing other people's voices. Hiking had become something like therapy for me, a way to clear my head after long weeks of work. Most weekends I stayed local, exploring trails near my home, but every few months I wanted something more remote, something that gave me that feeling of being far away from everything. That's how I ended up planning a solo hike in the mountains about 4 hours from where I lived. I had read that the area had rougher trails, not very popular, but still marked well enough to follow. That was exactly the kind of place I was looking for. I wanted quiet, not crowded paths. I packed my gear the night before: a lightweight tent, sleeping bag, food for 2 days, a small stove, plenty of water, and the basic survival items: map, compass, knife, and first aid kit. My plan was simple: hike in, set up camp by late afternoon, spend the night, and hike back out the next day. The morning I left, the weather was cool and clear. The drive took me into smaller roads, winding through woods and farmland, until finally I reached the gravel lot where the trail started. There were no other cars there. That gave me a strange mix of excitement and unease. I liked the idea of having the trail to myself, but it also reminded me that I would be completely alone out there. I double-checked my gear, locked my car, and set off. The first stretch of the trail was wide and easy, lined with tall trees that swayed in the light wind. The air smelled clean, almost sharp, like pine and wet earth. I could hear birds calling, leaves rustling, and nothing else. The sound of my boots crunching on the dirt path was steady and calming. I walked for hours, only stopping once in a while to drink water or check the map. The trail started narrowing as it climbed higher. Roots stuck out from the ground and rocks made footing uneven, so I had to watch my steps carefully. By early afternoon, I hadn't seen a single person. The silence grew heavier as the trail took me deeper into the forest. The trees were denser and the path got steeper. Sweat ran down my back under my pack, and I noticed how much the forest around me felt closed off. It wasn't scary exactly, just isolating. I reminded myself this was what I came for. I wanted to be away from the noise of the world. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a ridge where the trees thinned out and the view opened. I could see the mountains rolling out in the distance, the valleys below dark with shadow. I sat on a rock, drank water, and ate a protein bar. The wind felt stronger up there, and for the first time that day, I shivered a little. I didn't stay long. I still needed to find a good spot to camp before the sun got low. The trail beyond the ridge became narrower still, and I noticed sections where the dirt had eroded. There were sharp drops to one side, and the path looked like it hadn't been maintained in a long time. I slowed down, testing each step. The air was quieter now. Even the birds seemed gone. I kept moving, but a thought kept pressing in my head. If I slipped here, nobody would know. Nobody would even hear me. By late afternoon, I finally found a small clearing just off the trail, flat enough to set up my tent. I was relieved to get my pack off my shoulders. My body ached and my feet were sore. I pitched the tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and started boiling water for a simple meal. The forest was already dim, even though the sun hadn't fully set yet. The tall trees blocked most of the light. Shadows stretched long across the ground, and everything looked darker than it should have been for that hour. I ate quickly and cleaned up, By the time I was finished, the forest had gone quiet again. That strange, heavy silence. I sat for a while just listening. I thought maybe I would hear animals, but there was nothing. No rustle, no call, not even the wind anymore. That silence made me restless. I decided to crawl into the tent earlier than usual. Inside, I unrolled my sleeping bag, slipped in, and tried to relax. But I couldn't. I kept shifting, listening, waiting for some noise to break the silence. Hours seemed to pass that way. At some point, I must have dozed off, but I woke up suddenly in the dark. I didn't know why at first. Then I realized I had heard something outside. A crack, like a branch snapping. I held my breath. I heard it again, closer. Something was moving in the trees near my tent. My first thought was deer, but the steps didn't sound right. They were slower, heavier. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I told myself it had to be an animal. Bears sometimes roamed these areas. That thought didn't make me feel better. I lay frozen, listening as the sound circled the clearing. Then it stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. I stayed still for what felt like an hour, waiting, straining to hear anything. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under again, though it was a restless, shallow sleep. When morning came, I unzipped the tent slowly, bracing myself for what I might see. The clearing looked normal. Nothing seemed disturbed. But when I walked to the edge of the trees, I noticed footprints in the dirt. They weren't boots like mine. They weren't hooves. They looked like bare feet. I stood staring at them, my skin crawling. They were long, narrow prints, pressed deep into the soil, circling around where my tent had been. Some of them led back into the forest. I couldn't understand it. Who would be out here barefoot? And why would they come into my camp in the middle of the night without making themselves known? My stomach turned at the thought that someone had been watching me sleep. I packed up fast, barely eating anything. My plan to spend another night was gone. I just wanted out. The trail back would take me hours, but I didn't care. I slung my pack on my shoulders and started walking quickly, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. The forest didn't look the same anymore. Every shadow felt like it was hiding someone. Every snapped twig under my own boots made me jump. I kept telling myself to focus, to move steadily and not trip, but my nerves made me clumsy. After about an hour, I noticed something that froze me in place. On the dirt of the trail ahead, I saw more of those same barefoot prints. Fresh. They weren't there yesterday when I walked in. They were heading in the same direction I was going. I felt sick. Whoever it was, they were on the trail ahead of me. I didn't know what to do. If I kept going, I would eventually catch up to them, or they would be waiting. If I turned back, I would be moving toward the place they had circled my tent. I stood there, shaking, trying to steady my breathing. Finally, I decided I had no choice but to keep going. I stayed alert, gripping the knife in my pack side pocket. The trail wound through thick trees and brush, making it impossible to see far ahead. Every bend made me tense up, expecting to see someone standing there. My legs burned from the pace I was pushing, but fear kept me moving. Hours passed that way. I kept scanning the trail, the woods behind me. Once I thought I saw movement through the trees, a figure slipping out of sight, but it could have been my imagination. I didn't stop to check. By the time I reached the ridge again, the sun was low. I had lost track of how long I had been hiking. My body was exhausted, but I forced myself to keep going. I wanted nothing more than to see the gravel lot where my car was waiting. But when I finally reached it, my relief vanished. The lot was empty. My car was gone. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the spot where I had parked. I knew I hadn't taken a wrong turn. I knew this was the right place, but there was nothing, just gravel and trees. My chest tightened with panic. I tried to think. Maybe it had been towed, but why? Nobody was around when I left it. Or maybe someone had stolen it. The thought that whoever left those prints might have taken it made my stomach twist. Night was coming fast, and I had nowhere to go. The lot was miles from the nearest road, and I had no signal on my phone. I was trapped out there, with no car, no safe place, and the memory of those prints circling my tent. I knew I couldn't stay in the lot. It was too exposed. If someone had taken my car, they could come back. I grabbed my pack and hurried into the trees, moving off the trail, searching for a place to hide. I found a dense patch of brush and crawled inside, pulling branches over me. I lay there in the dark, heart racing, listening to the silence. That night was the longest of my life. Every sound felt sharp, every crack of a branch a threat. I didn't sleep at all. I just waited, counting the hours, until finally, the first gray light of morning touched the sky. When it was bright enough, I crawled out and forced myself back onto the trail. I had no choice but to walk. The nearest ranger station was more than 10 miles away, but it was my only chance. My legs ached. My body screamed for rest, but fear kept me moving. I never saw anyone on the trail that day. No hikers, no ranger. I had planned the hike for weeks. It was late summer. The days still hot, but the evenings cooler, and I wanted to take advantage of the long daylight hours before fall came. I picked a trail I had read about online, one that followed a ridge through a long stretch of forest, winding high above valleys and streams, and eventually leading to an old fire lookout tower that had been abandoned for decades. The trail was listed as challenging, but I had done difficult hikes before, and I felt ready for the challenge. I drove out early in the morning, leaving my small apartment before the sun had even come up. The roads were empty at that hour, and the first light was just spilling over the horizon by the time I reached the trailhead. The parking lot was almost empty. Only 2 other cars were parked there, both with heavy condensation on their windshields, which told me their owners had probably been camping overnight somewhere up the trail. I took my time packing up, checking my backpack to make sure I had everything: water, food, a small stove, a flashlight, extra batteries, a jacket, my phone, a map, and a first aid kit. I always prided myself on being prepared. The first part of the hike was peaceful. The forest was still damp from dew, and the air smelled of pine and wet earth. The trail climbed steadily, switchback after switchback, until I was sweating heavily. I kept sipping from my water bottle to stay ahead of thirst. Birds called from the branches above, and small animals scurried out of sight when I got too close. By late morning, I reached the first viewpoint, a rocky outcrop that overlooked the valley below. The sky was clear, and I could see for miles. The river below twisted like a silver ribbon, and the surrounding hills were blanketed in endless green. I sat down to catch my breath, feeling good about the progress I was making. The ridge itself was more rugged. The trail narrowed and became uneven, with loose rocks that made footing tricky. In places, the drop on one side was steep, a sheer fall into the trees below. I moved carefully, making sure every step was solid. After a couple more hours, I noticed that the forest had grown quieter. The birdsong had faded, and the air felt heavier. The sun was high now, beating down on me, and I stopped for lunch in a shaded spot. I ate slowly, enjoying the stillness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the silence was unusual. When I stood up to keep moving, I thought I heard something behind me, just a faint crunch of leaves. I froze and looked back, but the trail was empty. I brushed it off as maybe a squirrel or a branch falling. I kept going, but I started to notice signs that didn't sit right with me. The dirt on the trail had fresh scuff marks, like heavy boots had passed not long ago. At first I thought it was from the people whose cars I had seen earlier, but the direction of the tracks made me uneasy. They were behind me. Whoever made them had been going the same way I came from, but the impressions looked newer than mine. It was as if someone had been following, staying behind at a distance. I tried to ignore it. The trail wound through thickets of underbrush and past rocky slopes where the wind whistled. Hours passed. I stopped at a small spring to refill my bottle, crouching low to dip it into the cold, clear water. When I looked up, I thought I saw movement on the ridge behind me, a flicker of something dark against the bright rock. By the time I focused, it was gone. I felt my chest tighten. I told myself it was my imagination. Still, I quickened my pace. The ridge grew more isolated the farther I went. The forest thinned, leaving stretches of bare rock and scrub. The sun was beginning to sink lower, the light shifting into that long golden glow of late afternoon. I knew I needed to find a place to camp before night fell, but I also wanted to reach the old fire lookout, which wasn't far now. As I pushed on, the sense of being followed grew stronger. The crunch of footsteps came again, faint but deliberate, timed so they seemed to stop when I stopped. At one point, I turned sharply, hoping to catch whoever it was, but the trail was empty, winding back into the trees. By the time I reached the fire lookout, the sun was nearly down. The tower stood on a bare rise of rock, its wood weathered and gray, windows broken out. The metal staircase rusted but still intact. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I climbed up cautiously, the steps creaking under my weight, until I reached the platform. From there, I had a sweeping view of the land in every direction. The valleys were already sinking into shadow, and the sky above was streaked with orange and purple. I set down my pack and tried to relax. The height gave me a sense of safety. If someone had been following me, I would be able to see them approaching from here. But the trail behind me was empty. Night fell quickly. I cooked a simple meal with my small stove and ate it sitting on the wooden floor of the tower, watching as the last light faded. I felt a little calmer now. Maybe I had just been spooking myself. But when full darkness settled, the unease returned. The forest below seemed endless and black. Every sound carried. The distant crack of branches, the rustle of something moving through the undergrowth. I sat still, straining my ears, and I knew with certainty that there was someone out there. I kept my flashlight close, though I didn't want to use it too much. The beam would only make me more visible. I barely slept that night. Every time I drifted off, a sound would jolt me awake again. Once, in the middle of the night, I heard the distinct clink of metal on rock. That was no animal. When the first gray light of dawn came, I packed up quickly. I wanted off the ridge. The descent was harder. My legs were tired, and the trail was rough. The forest seemed darker than before, even in daylight. I kept glancing over my shoulder, and more than once I caught the brief shape of a figure moving between the trees, far behind but always there. The worst moment came when I reached a narrow section where the trail hugged a cliff face. The drop to my left was sheer, and the wall of rock to my right was too steep to climb. As I started across, I heard the sound of loose stones shifting behind me. My heart jumped. I didn't turn around. I just kept moving as fast as I dared, focusing on each step until I was across. Later, I found fresh boot prints again in the dirt, overlapping mine. They were larger than mine, heavy, deep impressions. Whoever it was, they had been there and close. By midday, I was exhausted, but I didn't dare stop for long. I ate while walking, forcing down energy bars. The silence of the forest pressed in, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps. At one point, I left the trail to relieve myself, moving a little way into the trees. When I came back, my stomach dropped. On the path, in the dirt where I had just been walking, was a single fresh print. It hadn't been there seconds before. Whoever it was, they were close enough to watch me and step out the moment I left. Panic set in fully then. I broke into a near run, stumbling over rocks, scraping my hands on branches. My pack bounced painfully against my back, but I didn't stop. Hours blurred together. My throat was dry, my legs weak, but the fear kept me moving. The parking lot had to be close now. I kept telling myself that. Just keep going, just reach the car. Finally, through the trees, I glimpsed a sliver of asphalt. Relief washed over me so hard it almost made me collapse. I stumbled the last stretch, bursting out of the trailhead and into the open. The lot was almost empty, just as it had been before, but this time my car was the only one there. The other two were gone. I fumbled my keys out, hands shaking, and unlocked the door. Before climbing in, I forced myself to look back one last time. The trail stretched into the trees, dark and silent. And there, just beyond the first bend, a figure stood, too far to see clearly, but unmistakably human. Watching, I slammed the door, started the engine, and drove away without looking back again. For days afterward, I couldn't stop replaying it in my head. The prints in the dirt, the sounds at night, the movement in the trees. Someone had followed me the entire way, never showing themselves fully, never getting too close, but always there. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I know how close I came to never making it back. That was the last time I hiked alone. I had been hiking alone many times before, but this trip was different. I wanted to push myself farther than I had ever gone, and I picked a long trail that wound through mountains, valleys, and forests where I had never been. I planned to spend 3 full days out there, camping each night at a new spot, carrying everything I needed in my pack. The weather was clear, the map seemed straightforward, and I felt ready. I didn't think much could go wrong. The first day started off fine. The trailhead was quiet that morning when I parked my car, and I barely saw anyone else. I adjusted my pack, tightened my boots, and started walking. The air was cool and sharp, the kind that wakes you up better than coffee. The ground was firm under my boots, and the path was wide at first, cutting through open fields with small streams running through them. I followed the markings on the trees, always making sure I was on the right trail. By mid-morning, I was deep into the forest. The trees were tall and close together, and sunlight came through in broken patches that moved across the dirt as the wind stirred the branches. I loved the smell of pine and damp soil. Felt peaceful, but in that quiet way where you're always aware of being alone. I could hear my boots crunching, the straps of my pack creaking, and the distant sound of a woodpecker. Every so often I stopped, drank water, and checked my map. Everything lined up. The first real challenge came when the trail narrowed. The map had shown an area where the path cut along the side of a mountain, but I hadn't imagined it would be that tight. The trail was little more than a strip of dirt carved into the slope. On one side, the mountain rose steep and rocky. On the other, it dropped off into a long, sheer fall into trees and boulders far below. The ground was dusty and loose, with small stones rolling away under each step. I moved slowly, planting my boots carefully, leaning into the mountain to keep my balance. My heart thudded in my chest as I edged forward. I told myself not to look down, but of course I did, and the height made my stomach lurch. I kept going, step by step, until the trail widened again and I could finally breathe. The rest of the first day went smoothly. I set up camp near a small stream, cooked a simple meal, and watched the light fade through the trees. The stars came out bright, sharper than they looked from the city. I slept lightly, waking up at every rustle, but nothing disturbed me. The second day was harder. The trail climbed higher, steeper, and rockier. My legs burned from the strain, and sweat soaked my shirt even in the cool air. I passed stretches of fallen trees where I had to climb over trunks slick with moss, then areas where the path wound through dense brush that scratched at my arms. My water supply dropped faster than I liked, and I rationed sips between landmarks. By late afternoon, the trail turned downward again, but it wasn't the kind of relief I expected. The path dropped into a deep ravine. The walls rose on either side, and the air was cooler, heavier, filled with the smell of wet leaves. The ground was uneven, with roots twisting across the dirt. I stumbled more than once, catching myself with my hands. Then I reached another narrow section. This one was worse than the first. The path cut across a cliff face, just wide enough for one boot at a time. Loose gravel slid at every step. The drop was dizzying, far steeper than before. The air felt still, as if even the birds didn't bother coming here. I crouched low, almost crawling, pressing myself into the wall of rock. My pack tugged at my balance, and I had to angle it so it wouldn't drag me backward. My throat was dry, my breathing loud in my own ears. Halfway across, a stone under my boot gave way and tumbled down. I froze, listening to it bounce and clatter until the sound vanished into the trees below. My hands shook as I inched forward again. When I finally reached solid ground, my legs were weak, trembling as if I had just run miles. I sat down, drank the last of my water, and tried to calm down. The map showed a small creek not far ahead, so I pushed on, desperate to refill. The creek turned out to be little more than a trickle over rocks, but I set up my filter and drank deeply. The cold water ran down my throat and eased the tightness in my chest. I stayed there longer than I should have, just listening to the quiet. That night, I camped in a clearing near the creek. The ground was uneven, and I had trouble getting comfortable. My mind kept replaying that narrow trail, the sound of the stone falling away, the thought of how close I had come to slipping. Sleep came in short bursts, full of uneasy dreams. The third day was when things went wrong. I woke before sunrise, stiff and tired. The air was colder, and fog hung low through the trees. I packed up quickly, wanting to get moving to stay warm. The map showed that the trail would climb again before dropping into another valley, where I planned to meet the road and head back to my car. I figured I could finish before dark if I kept a steady pace. First, the trail was clear. The fog thinned as the sun rose, and I found a rhythm again, my boots crunching steadily. But then the path split. One way curved upward, the other dipped down into dense trees. The markings were faded, almost gone, and I wasn't sure which was right. I checked my map, but the details didn't match perfectly. I chose the upward trail, thinking it would connect again. Didn't. The higher I went, the rougher the ground became. The trail thinned, then broke apart into patches of rock and dirt. Soon, there was no clear path at all. I stopped, turned, and looked back, but the way behind me was swallowed by trees and slope. I had gone too far to see the fork again. I tried to backtrack carefully, but the forest twisted in ways I didn't recognize. The trees looked the same in every direction, tall and close, their bark dark with moss. The ground sloped unevenly, pulling me off balance. I pulled out my compass, checked my map again, tried to line things up, but it didn't make sense. I kept moving, hoping I would cross the rail trail again, but instead I wandered deeper. Hours passed, my legs aching, my mouth dry. I rationed the last of my water, but it wasn't enough. My stomach growled, and I chewed a protein bar without tasting it. The forest grew thicker, darker. The sun was hidden by the canopy, and I couldn't tell how late it was. Then I saw it ahead, another narrow path along a steep slope. I stopped, staring at it. The dirt was loose, the drop even farther than before. I didn't want to cross it, but the other choice was to turn back into the trees where I had already been circling for hours. I decided to try. The first steps were slow, careful. I pressed my body into the wall, moved one boot at a time, breathed shallowly. The drop was a blur in my side vision. Sweat trickled down my face, my hands slipping against the rock. Halfway across, I felt the ground give under me. My boots slid, the dirt crumbling away. I dropped low, clutching at roots sticking out of the wall. My pack shifted, pulling me backward. I pressed in hard, heart racing so fast it hurt. For a long moment, I couldn't move. My arms trembled from holding on. My vision narrowed, and I fought the urge to panic. Slowly, I pulled myself upright again, inching sideways until I found firmer ground. When I reached the other side, I collapsed, gasping. My hands were scraped raw, my legs shaking. I wanted to cry, but no tears came. I forced myself up and kept moving. The trail didn't improve. It twisted through thickets, over rocks, down steep gullies. My water was gone again, my mouth dry and sticky. My body felt heavier with every step. As evening came, the forest grew darker. I stumbled often, catching myself on trees. My legs felt like wood, unresponsive. I set up camp in a miserable patch of dirt, barely clearing a space for my tent. I ate the last of my food, drank nothing, and lay awake listening to the sounds of the forest. Every snap of a twig made my heart leap. The next morning, I knew I had to find my way out. My map was useless now. I aimed downhill, figuring I would eventually reach a stream, maybe a road. The ground was slick, my boots sliding in mud. Branches whipped my face as I pushed through. Hours later, I stumbled onto a wider trail. Relief surged through me, so strong my knees nearly gave out. I followed it, barely thinking, just moving forward. Eventually, I heard the distant hum of cars. The sound pulled me faster, dragging me along. I broke out of the trees onto a gravel road, blinking in the sudden light. I had made it, I stood there, shaking, staring at the empty road. My body was bruised, scraped, and exhausted, but I was alive. When I finally made it back to my car, I sat behind the wheel for a long time before starting the engine. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. I thought about the narrow trails, the falls I almost took, the long hours lost in the woods. I realized I had been planning the hike for months. It wasn't anything famous or well-known. Not one of those places where hundreds of people gather every weekend to take pictures for social media. It was a trail I found buried in an old guidebook, one that described it as long, rugged, and not recommended for beginners. That was exactly what I wanted. I had been hiking for years, but I always seemed to stay on the popular routes. I wanted something harder, something longer, and most of all, something remote. The trail was supposed to stretch for nearly 20 miles through thick forest, ridgelines, and a series of steep switchbacks that climbed along the side of a canyon. According to the guidebook, there were 2 points where the path narrowed so much that it was just a few feet wide, with a sharp drop on one side. That detail stuck in my head as both exciting and intimidating. I wasn't afraid of heights, but I knew how dangerous those narrow spots could be if someone wasn't careful. Still, the thought of hiking somewhere so empty, somewhere far from the usual crowds, felt appealing. I set off early in the morning in late September. The air was cold enough to see my breath, but the sky was completely clear. I had packed light but thorough. Plenty of water, some energy bars, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, and a map of the area. I carried my phone too, but I knew signal would vanish once I got deep enough into the forest. I told myself that was fine. Part of the reason I came out here was to escape all that. The first couple of miles were easy. The path was wide, soft with fallen pine needles, and shaded by tall trees that swayed slowly in the breeze. I could hear birds overhead and the distant rush of water from a stream that ran parallel to the trail. The forest smelled of damp soil and resin, that sharp pine smell that always reminded me of being far from home. As the sun climbed higher, the forest grew warmer, and the light came down in shifting beams through the trees. I walked steadily, stopping now and then to drink water. The more I walked, the more the trail seemed to shrink around me. The trees grew denser, and the undergrowth rose higher, crowding the edges of the path. Every now and then, I brushed against branches that tugged at my jacket or scraped across my backpack. I reached the first steep section by mid-morning. The trail angled sharply upward, turning into a series of switchbacks that zigzagged up the side of a hill. My legs began to burn as I climbed, and my breath came heavier. The trees thinned slightly here, letting me see down into the forest below. It stretched endlessly, a rolling sea of green treetops with no sign of roads or houses. For the first time, I felt how far I had gone from anything familiar. It was thrilling, but it also pressed down on me with a quiet weight. By the time I reached the top of that hill, I was sweating and tired, but I felt good. The path leveled for a while, and I could catch my breath. The ground was drier here, the soil harder, scattered with rocks. A few birds scattered when I came through, their wings flashing pale in the sunlight. I kept moving, telling myself I would stop for lunch once I reached the first narrow section of the trail, the one described in the guidebook. When I finally came to it, I understood why the guidebook warned hikers about it. The path shrank to less than 4 feet across, carved into the side of a steep slope. On my right, the wall of rock rose sharply upward, too steep to climb without gear. On my left, the land fell away almost straight down into the trees far below. I crouched and touched the dirt beneath my boots. It was dry and loose, small stones shifting easily. I tested it by pressing harder, and sure enough, more dirt crumbled away over the edge. I told myself not to overthink it. I had done hikes like this before, just not for this distance. I kept my eyes forward, moving carefully, one step at a time. The ground was narrow, but it held. My balance was steady, and I focused on the trail ahead instead of the drop beside me. After maybe 50 yards, the path widened again, and I stepped back onto safer ground. My heart was pounding hard, but I smiled to myself. It was exactly the challenge I came for. I ate lunch sitting on a flat rock a little farther along the trail. The forest was quiet around me, except for the occasional gust of wind through the trees. I chewed slowly, drinking water between bites, and studied the map. I was nearly halfway. The second narrow section wasn't far ahead, somewhere along the canyon ridge. I figured if I made good time, I could finish the whole loop and be back at my car before it got dark. The hours passed as I hiked deeper. The forest seemed quieter the farther I went. I no longer heard many birds, and the trees felt taller, their shadows stretching longer across the path. The silence grew heavier, broken only by the sound of my boots and my breathing. At one point, I stopped just to listen, and I realized how absolute the stillness was. It was the kind of silence that made every small sound, like the creak of my pack straps or the crunch of gravel underfoot, seem unnaturally loud. When I finally reached the canyon ridge, the trees opened up. The ground dropped away into a deep, rocky canyon, its walls streaked with gray and brown. A thin river ran along the bottom, glinting in the sunlight. The trail followed the ridge, hugging its edge. Ahead, I saw where it narrowed again. This section looked even worse than the first. The path pinched tight against the canyon wall, maybe only 3 feet wide this time. Loose gravel scattered across its surface, and the drop to the river below looked brutally far. I crouched again, testing the ground. My stomach tightened when I felt how soft the dirt was under the thin layer of gravel. If I slipped, there would be no stopping. Still, I couldn't turn back. The idea of retracing miles of trail didn't sit right with me, and I wanted to finish what I started. I tightened the straps on my pack so it wouldn't shift, then stepped carefully onto the narrow section. Each step was slow and deliberate, my body leaning slightly toward the canyon wall. I kept one hand brushing the rock beside me for balance. Halfway across, a stone shifted under my boot. My leg jolted as the rock slid toward the edge, bouncing once before vanishing into the canyon. The sound of it striking far below echoed upward. My pulse hammered in my ears. I froze, forcing myself not to look down. I steadied my breathing and took the next step. Then another. Finally, the path widened again, and I stumbled onto it, my knees shaking with relief. But as I moved on, I realized the ground here wasn't much better. The dirt was dry and crumbling, breaking apart under my boots. In some places, the trail had eroded so badly it tilted slightly toward the canyon's edge. I slowed down, trying to place each foot on the firmest spots, but the more I walked, the more unstable it felt. I was almost past the worst of it when the trail gave way under me. It wasn't the whole path, just a chunk near the edge. My left foot landed, and the dirt slid out from beneath it. I felt myself falling sideways, my weight pulling toward the canyon. In a blind reaction, I threw myself against the wall of rock, slamming my shoulder hard. Pain shot through me, but I managed to grab at the rock face, my fingers scraping across rough stone until they caught a shallow ledge. My body dangled half over the drop, my feet kicking against nothing. My backpack tugged at me, pulling me harder toward the edge. I twisted and slammed my knee into the rock, gritting my teeth against the sharp pain. With everything I had, I hauled myself upward, scraping skin from my palms as I clawed at the stone. My boot found a small foothold, then another, and finally I shoved my body back onto the trail. I lay there on my stomach, gasping, my heart hammering so hard it felt like my ribs would crack. The ground where I had slipped was gone, crumbled into dust that now sprinkled faintly along the slope below. I sat up slowly, brushing dirt from my face. My hands were torn and bleeding, the skin on my shoulder already swelling from where I hit the rock. My knee throbbed, but it held when I put weight on it. I didn't move for a long time. The canyon stretched below me, quiet and endless, as if it hadn't noticed I nearly joined it. I drank water with shaking hands, trying to steady myself. The realization sank in slowly, heavier than anything else I had felt that day. If I had fallen, no one would have ever known. There was no signal, no other hikers, no sound except the wind and my own breathing. I was completely alone, and I had nearly died. When I finally stood again, I moved more carefully than I ever had in my life. Each step was measured, deliberate, as though the earth might crumble under me at any moment. I followed the trail along the canyon, past the narrowest points, until the ground finally widened and the trees returned. Only then did I allow myself to breathe normally again. The hike back felt endless. My body ached from the fall, and every muscle in my legs burned. The forest grew darker as the sun dropped lower, shadows stretching long and thin across the trail. I forced myself forward, step by step, ignoring the pain and the exhaustion. I just needed to get out. By the time I saw I had been planning that hike for weeks. It wasn't supposed to be anything too extreme, just a long trail through a national forest I had never been to before. I wanted to clear my head, push myself a little, and spend a few nights camping away from everything. I packed my gear carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, first aid kit, a map and compass, and all the little things you learn not to forget if you've camped enough times. My backpack was heavy, but I was used to that weight. The weather was supposed to be clear, and I thought it would be a quiet, steady trip through the woods. The trail started off wide and easy, the kind of path where you can hear your boots crunch over gravel and leaves while the sun filters down through tall trees. At first, I was enjoying it the way you want to enjoy a hike. Calm, steady, the smell of pine all around, the sound of a creek in the distance. I kept a good pace, taking breaks to sip water and check my map. Everything seemed fine, but I already knew the deeper I went, the less I would see of other people. That was part of the reason I came. As the hours went on, the trail narrowed and the woods grew thicker. The forest floor was covered in wet leaves that made each step a little tricky. I noticed how quiet it was compared to the beginning. No cars in the distance, no voices, not even the faint hum of power lines. Just forest sounds, birds far off, the rustle of branches, and the creak of trees swaying in the wind. That kind of silence has a way of making you feel small. By mid-afternoon, I realized I hadn't seen another person since the parking lot. That didn't bother me much, but I made sure to double-check my map. The trail had forks that weren't clearly marked, and I didn't want to make a mistake. I slowed down, studied my compass, and matched the curves of the path with the lines on the map. I convinced myself I was on the right track. When I finally stopped for the night, I found a flat clearing off the trail near a small stream. I pitched my tent, boiled some water for food, and sat against a log while eating. The sun dropped fast, and before long I was in full darkness with nothing but the sound of water moving over rocks. I crawled into my sleeping bag and tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling of how far away I was from anything. Every sound outside the tent felt louder in the dark. The snapping of a branch, the crunch of leaves. I told myself it was just animals moving around, which was true, but that didn't help me sleep much. The next morning I packed up and kept moving. The trail twisted uphill through dense forest, and I started to feel the weight of the pack digging into my shoulders. My legs ached as I pushed on. Around midday, I realized something was wrong. The path I was on didn't match the map anymore. The slope of the land and the direction of the creek didn't line up. I stopped, dropped my pack, and spread the map out on the ground. I went over it again and again, but I couldn't figure it out. I must have taken the wrong turn at one of the forks. I thought about turning back, but I told myself I could loop around. Trails usually connected to each other, and I didn't want to lose the progress I had already made. So I pressed on, thinking I'd eventually cross back onto the main path. By late afternoon, the trail I was following faded until it was barely visible. It looked more like a game trail than a hiking trail. I slowed down, scanning for any sign of a blaze on the trees, but there was nothing. I knew at that point I was officially off the marked trail. I pulled out my compass and tried to steady my nerves. I picked a direction that I thought would take me back toward the main route, shouldered my pack again, and kept walking. The woods grew rougher. Fallen trees blocked the way, thorn bushes scraped at my arms, and the ground turned uneven with hidden holes and rocks. I stumbled more than once, catching myself with my hands. My water supply was still okay, but I was burning through it faster than I wanted to. That night, I set up camp again, this time with less comfort. The ground was sloped, the trees crowded close, and I couldn't hear the stream anymore. It felt like I was deeper in the woods than I wanted to be. I forced myself to eat, even though I wasn't hungry. Lying in my sleeping bag, I listened to the night sounds again, but this time they made me tense. I thought about search parties I'd read about, people lost in the woods who wandered in circles. I tried to tell myself I wasn't one of them. The next day was worse. I woke up early, determined to get myself back on track. I used the compass to guide me, aiming to head west where I believed the main trail ran. I walked for hours, pushing through brush and climbing over deadfall, but the land kept rising and falling in ways that didn't match the map. The more I checked it, the less sense it made. By mid-afternoon, I was sweating hard, my legs heavy, and my throat dry. My water was running low. I stopped to filter more from a muddy pool, crouching down to pump it into my bottle. The taste was earthy, but I forced it down. I kept moving, but soon I noticed something else. The forest was starting to feel different. Not supernatural, just unfamiliar in a way that made me uneasy. The trees were closer together, the light dimmer, and the ground uneven with exposed roots. The silence felt heavier, broken only by my own movement. Every time I stopped, I heard nothing. That emptiness made me feel like the woods were swallowing me up. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking to sounds, branches snapping, leaves rustling. I knew it was probably deer or smaller animals, but being alone made it feel different. At one point, I sat up, clutching my knife, heart pounding, staring into the dark as if something might step out. Nothing did, but the fear stayed. The following day, exhaustion started to wear me down. My pace slowed, and I began stumbling more often. I kept thinking I saw paths ahead, but when I reached them, they faded into nothing. I tried marking trees with my knife to track where I had been, but it didn't help much. My food was running low. I had rationed carefully, but hunger gnawed at me constantly now. On the fourth night, I made camp without a fire. I didn't want the smoke to give away my position in case I was closer to people than I thought, but part of me also didn't want to draw attention from anything else in the woods. I ate the last of my trail mix and lay awake for hours, staring at the fabric of my tent lit faintly by the moon. By the fifth day, panic started to set in. I was weaker, my legs shaky, my throat raw from thirst. My map was useless now. I kept walking in what I thought was the right direction, but the forest seemed endless. I found another stream and drank straight from it, not caring about filtering anymore. The cold water gave me some strength, but not much. Late that afternoon, as I stumbled up a ridge, I finally saw something different, a faint line cutting through the trees. At first, I thought it was another animal path, but as I got closer, I saw it was wider. My chest tightened. It was a trail, not the same one I started on, but a real man-made trail. Relief washed over me so strong I nearly collapsed. I followed it, forcing my legs to keep moving. The sun was dropping fast, and shadows stretched across the ground, but I didn't stop. After another mile, I saw a wooden sign nailed to a tree. I couldn't even read it clearly through my tears, but I knew it meant I was back in range of people. An hour later, just as the last light drained from the sky, I stumbled into a small campground. A couple of empty fire pits and picnic tables sat scattered in the clearing. It wasn't busy, but it was enough. I dropped my pack, sat heavily on the ground, and let out a breath that felt like I had been holding it for days. I wasn't proud of how scared I had been, but I was alive. I had pushed too far off the trail, trusted myself too much, and nearly paid for it. I spent that night under the open sky, no tent, just staring up at the stars. Every sound still made me twitch, but this time I wasn't lost. The next morning, weak but steady, I followed the road that led out of the campground. It took hours, but eventually, I heard the distant sound of cars. That was the moment I knew it was over. I had made it back. The hike was supposed to be a peaceful trip, just a break from everything, but it turned into the hardest experience I've ever had. I learned what it really feels like to be alone, lost, and tested in the woods. And I knew, as I walked back towards safety, that I'd never forget how close I came to not making it out. had been planning the trip for months. Hiking had always been something I enjoyed, though most of the time it was on familiar trails near home where I knew what to expect. This time, I wanted to push myself a little farther. I had been reading about a long trail that wound deep into the mountains. It wasn't one of the famous ones. It didn't appear in glossy magazines or popular websites, but people who knew the area spoke of it as a hidden gem. That made it appealing to me. I thought if I went there, I'd find peace, isolation, and a chance to really test myself. I drove out early one Saturday morning in late summer. The air was already warm, but not heavy. The sun had just started burning through the thin layer of mist that clung to the valleys. My backpack was stuffed with all the basics. Food for 3 days, plenty of water, a filter, a tent, sleeping bag, and a map that had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases looked ready to tear. I told myself I'd go slow and steady. The plan was simple. Hike in most of the first day, find a good place to camp, and push deeper the next day before heading back. The start of the trail looked harmless enough. A wide dirt path cut through tall grass before climbing into the woods. Birds chattered overhead, and I could hear the distant trickle of water somewhere out of sight. I walked at a good pace, my boots crunching against the gravel, the straps of my pack tugging at my shoulders in a familiar way. As the morning turned into noon, I noticed how quickly the trail narrowed. What had started as a clear, wide path soon became a thin, rocky line winding between trees and sharp drops. I kept checking the map, making sure I was where I thought I was. The trail markers were faint, old paint on trees that had begun to peel. I had to pay close attention not to drift onto deer paths or side trails that led nowhere. The climb was harder than I thought it would be. The ground tilted upward sharply, and the soil was loose. My legs burned, and sweat soaked through my shirt. I told myself it was worth it because the higher I went, the better the view would be. Sure enough, around mid-afternoon, I found myself on a ridge where the trees parted. I could see for miles. Rolling hills stacked against one another, deep valleys choked with pine, and beyond them a faint blue line of more mountains. It was beautiful, but there was also something overwhelming about it. Standing there, I realized how far I was from anything familiar. I ate a quick lunch, nuts, and dried fruit before continuing. The trail bent sharply after the ridge and dropped down the other side. Here it grew trickier. Rocks jutted up from the ground, roots twisted across the path, and the drop to my left was steep. I took each step carefully, planting my boots with full weight before moving the other foot. It was sometime late in the afternoon when I first felt uneasy. At first I thought it was just the quiet. The trail had grown silent except for the occasional snap of a twig under my boots. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my own breathing. I stopped and stood still, waiting for something to break the silence. Nothing did. I brushed it off and kept going. But the feeling stayed. The deeper I went, the less the trail looked like something people used. Fallen branches hadn't been cleared. Parts of the path had crumbled away. The slope grew sharper until at one point the trail was no wider than the length of my boot, with a steep drop on one side. My heart thudded in my chest as I pressed myself against the mountain wall and inched across. The loose gravel under my feet slid a little, and for a moment I thought I was going to fall. Somehow I made it across, but it rattled me more than I wanted to admit. By the time the sun dipped lower, I knew I needed to stop for the night. I found a patch of flat ground a little ways off the trail, just big enough for my tent. I dropped my pack, stretched my aching shoulders, and got to work. Setting up camp was a routine I knew well, and that comforted me. Tent staked, sleeping bag unrolled, food eaten. Still, when darkness came, I lay awake longer than usual. The woods pressed in on all sides, and the silence felt heavy. I listened to every sound, the creak of branches, the occasional scurry of something small in the underbrush. Nothing threatened me, but my mind wouldn't rest. Eventually I slept, though it wasn't deep. I woke several times during the night, startled by dreams I couldn't remember. At dawn, I packed up and set out again. The trail grew even more difficult. It twisted upward again, this time steeper, the soil damp and slick. I slipped several times, once landing hard on my knee. Pain shot through my leg, but I could still walk, so I kept moving. By mid-morning, the air had grown warmer, but under the thick trees it stayed dim and cool. Then came the section that nearly ended everything. I reached a stretch where the trail clung to the side of the mountain. The path was no wider than a narrow shelf, with the wall of rock to my right and nothing but open air to my left. I could see the valley far below, a green sea of trees. One misstep and I would fall. I slowed down, planting each foot with care. My hands brushed against the rock wall for balance. Halfway across, I felt the ground shift under me. A piece of loose rock gave way, tumbling into the open air. I froze, my heart hammering. My boots slipped slightly, and for a terrifying moment I felt my balance tilt toward the edge. I dropped to my hands and knees, pressing myself flat against the trail, my body shaking. It took several minutes before I dared to move again. Inch by inch, I crawled forward until the path widened just enough to stand. My legs trembled as I pushed myself upright. I forced myself to keep walking, though every step felt like I was on the edge of falling again. When I finally reached safer ground, I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air. Sweat poured down my face. I realized then how dangerous this trail truly was. The map had made it look simple, but paper never showed the reality of crumbling paths and loose rock. The thought of turning back crossed my mind, but I shook it off. Going back meant crossing that narrow ledge again. I told myself forward was the only choice. The hours dragged on. My legs ached, and blisters formed on my feet. My water supply dwindled faster than I expected, and when I refilled at a small stream, the taste of filtered water was metallic and warm. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in. The air grew heavy, and the woods darkened. I smelled rain before I felt it. Soon the sky opened up, dumping sheets of water onto the trail. The soil turned slick, mud pulling at my boots. I slipped several times, my hands and clothes caked with dirt. When I finally found a place to stop for the night, I was soaked and shivering. I set up my tent as fast as I could, though the rain made it miserable work. Crawling inside, I stripped off my wet clothes and curled into my sleeping bag. My stomach growled, but I was too tired to eat. The rain hammered down for hours. Water pooled under the tent, seeping through the ground sheet. I barely slept, my body tense, listening to the storm. By morning, the rain had eased, but fog covered everything. I packed up in silence and kept walking, though I knew I was nearing my limit. The fog made it worse. I could only see a few yards ahead. The trail disappeared into a white blur, and the world felt smaller, tighter. I walked slowly, terrified of stepping wrong. The path tilted downward, slick with mud, and more than once I slid several feet before catching myself on a tree or rock. At one point I slipped so badly I went down hard, sliding on my side until I smashed against a boulder. Pain flared in my ribs, sharp and deep. I lay there for a long moment, clutching my side, gasping. Breathing hurt, but nothing felt broken. I forced myself up and kept moving, though every step was agony. Hours later, exhausted and hungry, I stumbled upon something I hadn't expected: the remains of an old campsite. A blackened fire ring, bits of trash half buried in the dirt, and a broken tarp tangled in the trees. Seeing it gave me a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief because it meant other people had been here once. Dread because it looked abandoned, as if whoever used it left in a hurry. I didn't stay long. Something about it felt wrong, so I pushed on. By evening, the trail finally began to level out. My map showed a small logging road not far ahead. If I reached it, I could follow it back toward civilization. The thought gave me a burst of energy. I pressed forward, ignoring the pain in my ribs and the blisters on my feet. When I finally stepped onto the logging road, I nearly cried with relief. It was rough and overgrown, but wide compared to the trail. I dropped my pack and sat in the dirt, drinking the last of my water. The road wasn't easy. It stretched for miles, winding down through the hills, but at least it was solid ground. I limped along for hours until at last, near dusk, I saw a distant shape that made my chest ache with gratitude. A parked truck. It was old and rusted, but it meant I was close to people. I followed the road until it spat me I never thought one hike could change the way I see the outdoors, but the memory of that trip still stays with me in a way I wish it didn't. Hiking had always been something I loved. I liked the quiet of the woods, the way the air smelled clean, the sound of leaves crunching under my boots, the way my legs burned after a climb but felt strong at the same time. I had done plenty of trails before, some short ones near home and some longer day hikes in nearby mountains. I considered myself prepared and confident enough. But confidence can make you careless, and that is exactly what happened to me on this trip. It was late summer, and I had a free weekend with nothing planned. The weather was warm but not too hot, and the forecast called for clear skies. I decided I wanted to do a hike I hadn't done before, something new and challenging. I looked through a few maps I had, scrolling online too, and I picked out a trail that looked interesting. It was in a forest area about an hour and a half away by car. It wasn't the most popular spot, but that appealed to me. I liked the idea of having space to myself. I packed my backpack that morning. Water bottles, a few snacks, a small first aid kit, flashlight, multi-tool, and a paper map I had printed out just in case. I wore my sturdy boots and comfortable clothes. Everything seemed fine and I felt ready. The drive was easy. I remember pulling into the small dirt parking lot at the trailhead, seeing only a couple of other cars parked. That gave me a little confidence that I wouldn't be completely alone out there, though I didn't expect to run into many people. I slung my backpack on, locked my car, and set off onto the trail. The beginning was beautiful. The forest felt alive but calm. Birds were singing overhead, insects buzzed faintly in the distance, and the trees made the air smell rich and earthy. The ground was firm but soft in places where pine needles had collected. I walked at a steady pace, taking deep breaths, enjoying the rhythm of moving forward with no distractions. The trail wound up gently at first, then began to climb more steeply as it went higher. I followed the signs at first, the wooden posts with arrows that pointed toward different branches of the trail. But at some point, maybe about 2 hours in, I realized I hadn't seen a marker in a while. The trail was still visible beneath me, just a narrow dirt path cutting through the forest, so I didn't worry at first. I assumed another sign would show up soon. I kept walking, telling myself it was all part of the loop shown on the map. The air grew hotter as the sun rose higher. I stopped a few times to drink water and wipe sweat from my forehead. The woods grew quieter too. I noticed fewer birds, less movement around me. The silence started to feel heavy, like the kind that presses in and makes every small sound stand out more. My own footsteps seemed louder than before. At some point, I checked the map again. The problem was that the trail I was on didn't seem to match what was printed. I thought maybe I had taken a wrong turn at a fork I didn't remember. The path I was on wasn't marked on the map, or if it was just a faint dotted line that didn't make much sense. I tried to convince myself it was fine. Trails didn't just disappear. They always led somewhere. I pushed on, but the path grew narrower, rougher. In some places, plants pushed up from the ground and brushed my legs as I walked through. It looked less maintained, almost forgotten. My heart started beating harder, not from the climb, but from a quiet worry building in the back of my mind. I stopped again, pulled the map out, and tried to match landmarks around me with what I saw on paper. The trees all looked the same, though. The slopes and valleys weren't obvious in the thick woods. It was impossible to tell where I was. That was when the first real fear sank in. I realized I didn't actually know where I was anymore. Still, I told myself I wasn't lost. If I kept walking, I'd eventually hit a road or another trail. That's what I thought. So I kept moving. Hours passed. The sun climbed to its peak and then began to lower again. The shadows grew longer between the trees, making the forest feel darker. My water supply had dropped to half, and I forced myself to sip slowly. I ate a small snack, trying not to think about how much food I had left. I felt my stomach tighten anyway, not from hunger but from unease. The worst part wasn't just being lost. It was the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I stopped to rest, the woods felt too still. When a branch snapped somewhere off in the distance, my head jerked toward it instantly. I told myself it was just animals, deer, squirrels, maybe a raccoon, but the sound of footsteps sometimes felt heavier than that. It felt like something was pacing me, staying just far enough back to stay hidden. I picked up my pace, though I tried not to run. Running didn't feel safe. Running could lead to twisting an ankle or losing the trail completely. I forced myself to breathe steady, eyes scanning the path ahead and ears straining for sound. As the afternoon stretched on, the trail thinned until it was barely a trail at all. I found myself pushing through undergrowth, swatting at branches, and stepping carefully over roots. My legs ached, my shirt clung to me with sweat, and my backpack straps dug into my shoulders. I felt tired but too afraid to stop for long. The light was dimming, and I knew night would make everything worse. At one point, I thought I heard something behind me, like the crunch of leaves underfoot. I froze, listening. The forest was silent again, only the faint rustle of leaves high in the canopy. My skin crawled and I forced myself forward. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, panic rose sharp in my chest. Darkness spread through the forest fast, and I dug into my bag for the flashlight. When I turned it on, the beam cut through the shadows, but it felt weak against the endless trees. My world shrank to the circle of light in front of me. The noises started again. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, heavier sounds that seemed to stop whenever I stopped. I kept swinging the light behind me, but it only showed empty woods. That emptiness somehow felt worse. My throat was dry, my chest tight. I had to find a place to stop. Hiking blindly in the dark was too dangerous. My best choice was to hunker down, conserve energy, and wait for daylight. I hated the idea, but I knew it was the only option. I found a small clearing, just enough open space to sit down. I dropped my backpack, sat with my back against a tree, and kept the flashlight close. I tried to rest, but every noise kept me on edge. My body tensed at every crack in the distance. The forest felt alive in a way that wasn't comforting anymore. It felt like it was watching me. I didn't sleep much. My eyes kept drifting shut, but every time, a sound jolted me awake again. My flashlight batteries were draining, and I tried to use it sparingly. The night stretched on forever. I counted minutes in my head, waiting for the faintest glow of dawn. When morning finally came, I felt drained but relieved. The woods looked less threatening in the daylight, though they still felt endless. I ate a little, drank carefully from what was left, and stood up to continue. My muscles ached, my throat burned, but I kept moving. Hours passed again. The sun climbed, the air warmed, and I stumbled forward through terrain that grew rougher. I thought I spotted signs of human presence once. A broken piece of wood, a faint shape of something cut, but it led nowhere. My hope rose and fell so fast it made me dizzy. By afternoon, my water was almost gone. My tongue felt dry, and my stomach cramped with hunger. I started to think about mistakes I had made, how I should have told someone exactly where I was going, how I should have brought more supplies, how I should have turned back the moment the trail didn't look right. At one point, I heard that sound again. Footsteps behind me, heavier than mine. I spun, flashlight in hand, though it was daytime, but nothing was there. My skin prickled all over. Maybe it was an animal, maybe not. Either way, I didn't want to find out. I moved faster, forcing my tired legs to keep going. Late that day, when I thought I couldn't walk anymore, I stumbled into a rocky slope that led downward. At the bottom, I saw a strip of dirt that didn't look natural. I followed it, and my heart leapt when I realized it was a road. A rough one, maybe for logging trucks, but still a road. Relief washed over me so hard I almost fell to my knees. I staggered along it, not even caring which way it led. I just knew it had to connect to somewhere, and it did. After maybe another hour of walking, I saw a small cabin in the distance, weathered but solid. I made my way to it, legs trembling with exhaustion. Turned out someone was there, a ranger checking the property. He was shocked to see me stumbling out of the woods, dirty, pale, dehydrated. He gave me water, food, and eventually a ride back to the main road where my car was. When I finally sat behind the wheel, safe but shaking, I realized just how close I had come to something worse. If I hadn't found that road, if I had run out of water completely, if I had injured myself while lost, I don't know how it would have ended. Since then, I've never gone hiking without preparing far.